Hey Colton, so this is my second video from China, and as you know, in China I'm an English teacher, so I spend most of my time, teaching English to Chinese people. One question that I get asked a whole lot is, why is English so hard? Or, why is English so weird? Now, English is a pretty prevalent language in the modern world. It is an official language of almost 60 sovereign states. It is the third most common native language on the planet, and it is an official language of both the European Union and the United Nations. But, as these Chinese kids so articulately put it is kind of weird. Here, let's try something. Go ahead and pronounce these words out loud, and then think about what it would be like to learn English as a foreign language. Teacher, how do I know when it makes an O sound or when it makes an UF sound? Ooh, when it does, I don't know. So Golden, I thought maybe you might be curious about why English is so weird as well, so I thought I'd try and maybe answer that question. So there is this little island off of the west coast of Europe known as Britain. Sometime before the 1st century BC, a group of people left continental Europe and immigrated to the British Isles. And these people brought with them various Celtic and Gaelic languages. Then around 40 AD, the Romans, who had this huge empire, thought to themselves, it would be cool if our empire was, bigger. So they conquered the Celtic people and brought Latin to Britain. The Romans stayed until like AD 410, until the Roman Empire sort of just kind of fell apart. They could no longer afford to maintain their outposts in Britain and kind of just declared bankruptcy and left the island to whoever wanted to come and take it. And who would come? The Vikings! As a side note, I feel like the Vikings really got around. I feel that because of Vikings is over half the answers to weird historical questions. Because of Vikings. I'd love to see that on a t-shirt. But these Vikings coming from the Scandinavian countries invaded and with them brought Norse languages. However, the Celtic, Britain, Latin, post-Roman people who still lived there didn't really appreciate being invaded by Viking raiders and hired Saxon mercenaries from the continent to help them fight off the Vikings. After doing some high-quality Viking killing, the Saxons realized that Britain was actually kind of cool, and that rather than protect it, they would invade it. By about AD 600, there were 7 main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had been formed, all speaking forms of this Anglo-Saxon language. For 300-ish years, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and Vikings from Denmark and Norway fought each other for control. In the 9th century, the Vikings had nearly conquered all of Britain, leaving only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom, which was ruled by not Batman's butler, Alfred the Great, who was great because he could deal with the Vikings. Did I mention how gnarly Vikings are? Alfred, the not butler of Batman but still great, managed to conquer most of Britain, and his people held it for over 100 years. In which time this Anglo-Saxon language continued to develop. The language that did develop is also referred to as Old English. In the 11th century, the last Anglo-Saxon king, Harold II, was busy fighting Vikings up north when William of Normandy just felt like he wanted to go conquer something. Through confusing marriages and relations and politics that I don't really understand, William of Normandy felt that he was a little bit maybe entitled to rule Britain. And while the Saxons were off fighting the Vikings, he figured it was a really great time to invade. In 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, William of Normandy defeated Harold II and made Norman French the official language of the British Isles. He also became William the Conqueror, which is a lot cooler nickname than of Normandy. One of the ways he strengthened his regime was by appointing French-speaking nobles to many of the important positions across the country. Because the upper class all spoke French and the lower class all spoke Anglo-Saxon, a hybrid language was sort of created where these two languages met. For example, pig is an Anglo-Saxon word used by the peasants working in the field, while pork is a Norman French word used by the aristocrats to describe the same animal that they were eating off of their dinner tables. In very simplified terms, after generations, this hybrid of languages became known as Middle English, which is what Chaucer wrote in. After a lot more years of fighting and confusing family relationships and claims to the throne, a guy by the name of Henry V was in charge. It was under his rule that official documents began to use this hodgepodge language spoken by the common people known as English rather than French. And then in 1476, William Caxton introduced the printing press to England and began printing books in English in London. The printing press was super important. It, one, legitimized English as a real literary thing, and And two, it solidified English as a language, relatively freezing its progression from change. It was in this time period, known as the early modern period, that Shakespeare wrote his plays and King James commissioned his Bible. And while the language that they use is a little bit different from the way we speak today, it's incredible that after 500 years we can still completely understand what they wrote. So why is English so weird? Well, it's at least in part to the Celtic, Gaelicing, immigrating, Roman, conquering, empiring, then leaving, Viking, pillaging, Viking, invading, Saxon, protecting, invading, protecting, losing, Norman, conquering, ruling, Frenching, aristocratic, writing, printing, and speaking. People who lived on a little island in the Atlantic. But now, how do I go about explaining that to Chinese adolescents?